recording. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the WIOA Title I-B quarterly performance office hours this quarter. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I will be on for technical support today. If you need anything, feel free to reach out to me via the chat. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started this afternoon. We are on Zoom meeting, so you have full microphone and video capability. We ask that you refrain from unmuting yourself, though, unless you have a question or comment whenever we pause to do those. And then if you have a question or comment throughout the actual content of today, you can feel free to type those in the chat. We will be recording this and posting it on Illinois WorkNet as well as our Illinois Workforce Academy website. So that way, if anyone was unable to join us today, they will have access to that. And we also have closed captioning on today for accessibility or note-taking purposes if you need to use that. Mark, did we want to do our polls today?
No, I don't think so. I think we, just looking at the names, I think we know pretty much everyone that's on today. With those quarterly office hours, we kind of know who the targeted audience is. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. All right, well then I'll hand it off to you, Mark. I think I'm done with the housekeeping.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. Appreciate your facilitating again today and all the work you do for us throughout all of our technical assistance. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Appreciate you putting this on your calendar. I know we gave you a little bit of short notice, but hopefully you had this already marked off after the last one when we identified today as our date. It's a little bit off track of when we typically want to do these, which is the third Wednesday, but we've got some conflicts next week. So again, appreciate you joining. I'll be presenting some of the information later on today. Paula will start things off with some information on follow-up services. We did a session at the WIOA Summit. It was great to see many of you, but I know some of you weren't able to join, and that follow-up session was not recorded or live virtually. So we wanted to recap some of that information, make sure all of you receive the important pieces of that without actually redoing the entire session. Some of it was just recap and refresher of information to kind of set the stage. So as Paul is going through that, as Kirsten said, if you've got any questions, maybe you have a hole in the information you're trying to gather from her presentation, don't hesitate to put something in the chat. We'll take a little break after she's done to take any questions you might have over the microphones. I'm going to give a little bit of a follow-up to a presentation Lisa Jones did last Monday on potential reauthorization of WIOA, but I'm going to focus solely on the performance implications of that legislation that's going through the House. Well, actually now in the Senate, so we'll let you see what they're talking about. It's kind of fast-tracked, been going along pretty briskly, so we want to make sure everyone's aware of what they're talking about. Then give you a real quick rundown. I know we've done this before, but we're getting closer and closer to the upcoming local negotiations. So I just want to give you a little bit of a timeline of what you all can expect for those. And then we'll finish with another opportunity for any questions, maybe take some recommendations for our next quarterly office hours that'll occur in August so we can start planning for those. So I'm going to turn it over to Paula now to talk a little bit about follow-up services.
Hello, good afternoon. So today, what our goal is on follow-up services is to reiterate some high-level information that we provided at the WIOA Summit in a session specific to follow-up services, and Jim Potts participated and presented quite a bit during that session. It's much more detailed, but here today, I think we had about 30 attendees in the summit session. But Mark and I wanted to make sure that this group also received that information shared in the entire session. So first of all, what we provided was a big reminder on LWIBs needing to have their local follow-up policies. specific in your areas. So they must be developed and implemented. And then another part of that is to review them like routinely in case they need updates. So they're always in line with like OET's guidance. And it's very crucial to update when OET makes changes, so everyone's in compliance. And a key to all of this is to communicate this with all of your staff so they know the rules, especially anything that changes, to eliminate all confusion and nip problems in the bud if anyone's confused about what is current in policy. So the key to this, again, is just regular review, update accordingly, then communicate effectively. This applies to all policies that need to be maintained at a local level. So next slide, please. And this actually is a poll, Kirsten. We're just trying to get at LWIA's attention on their local follow-up policies for managers and staff. So when it comes to local policy development on follow-up services in your LWIAs, I could say this is true in your LWIA, and please select all that apply. The first one is our follow-up policy was updated since WIOA policy was released on June 18th, 2020. So it's right in line as it should be. I'm not even aware of a local policy on follow-up services in our area. This is on our to-do list. In addition, we know and we regularly disseminate information on follow-up services to our staff and stakeholders. We are planning technical assistance on follow-up services. And we'll give you a second or minute to answer.
We'll give everyone a little bit longer. We still have about 10 people we're waiting on.
Okay, I mean, has everyone had enough time to answer? You can, there we go.
There's the results if you want to debrief, Paula.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can capture this, I believe, in our recording. So this is very good. 83% have updated them since 2020. So that means compliant. Sometimes you're not aware that local areas are also held accountable for their own specific local policy. Maybe you've just been following OETs. On our to-do list, 4%, probably because if you add up the numbers, 83% of you have this done. 50% regularly disseminate the information on follow-up services, and then 21% are planning it. So with those lower percentages of the key points in communicating it, there could be many factors for those counts, and maybe because you don't have time to provide TA, you are waiting on TA from us, but we can look into those results and think about what next steps to take with that. So thank you very, very much for answering those. That's something I don't think we've ever asked before, or I haven't. in performance. So what we shared in the summit session were key points that, and I call them insights because in the past couple months, we have had one-on-one calls. Mark Burgess, Laura Dom, and I, Jim Potts, have had calls and detailed email communications with questions to Department of Labor Region 5 staff. We were seeking clarification and we got it. So the key for this is that for adult and dislocated workers, the follow-up period should begin at the time they were placed into unsubsidized employment. That is when you begin your decision point of starting follow-up. This is key, and this means anytime during participation in your programs, they could be in an open career service, their open training service. It may also start after they completed their services. They met their goals, the exit was determined, and they're placed in unsubsidized employment then. This can be further defined later. We have a visual for this, but it's just key in determining that follow-up must start at placement in unsubsidized employment. That could be a goal of their employment. This is an example, if they're in a CNA training and they secure their goal job at a hospital when they're still in their occupational skills training, that is when follow-up should begin as a case note. So to try to differentiate this and relieve any confusion, follow-up activities and services are all of those items named under the definition in the service matrix, right? So it's A through F. But since timing and proper reporting is key, we don't want anyone under the impression that, oh, I can't enter a follow-up service because their occupational skills training for their nursing program is open, but they truly did gain WIOA-related unsubsidized employment in their goal job. So what you do, you're beginning a follow-up activity and putting a case note. You're getting credit, you're starting the clock on when you provided that, aligned with employment. And then the services are when you are actually documenting a follow-up service with that date. This is WIOA law. We don't like to tie it to a current system that limits that follow-up service with the date. So that is our whole goal behind this new concept of activities and services for staff to make sure they get those in there. Next slide, please. So youth follow-up activities are defined just like youth program elements. Everyone's pretty much familiar with this as from my perspective, but for newer staff, we just wanted to highlight in that session, like youth follow-up activities straight out of the services matrix look just like the youth program elements, many of them defined in the youth services matrix tab. So the definitions are the same. The key is to differentiate when youth follow-up must start or when they're truly getting these as a participant. There's many different strategies for that, and key is to look at the ISS when their goals are met and when all their needs are met, when they don't need anything else, they probably are transitioning to the follow-up phase and receiving the follow-up services, which is very confusing because they do look just like the youth elements. Then one thing Jim explained is to clarify the difference between unsubsidized employment versus subsidized. So your unsubsidized is what we are allowed to track and report and tie to follow-up. is when the employer isn't receiving any public funds, WIOA, or other to offset the wages. There's no subsidizing of that employment. It's on their own. So an example given was when work-based learning result in unsubsidized employment, like an OJT, the first day of unsubsidized employment, is the day after the OJT is no longer subsidized by local area funds. So that's key to take credit for that employment. Supplemental, also a clarification, it can be unsubsidized. This is just a type of employment that it's a system thing, needs to be manually entered so everyone can track when someone went, as an entrepreneur, started their own trucking business, or other businesses for which their wages aren't getting reported to IDES. So we lack that upload. That's all it is. And what we were wanting to clarify for staff, especially, they just think they need to enter that supplemental is its own category. It's really not. It can be unsubsidized. So next slide, please. Okay, for all the staff at the session, we just wanted to clarify this bit of insight. Follow-up services are they're not supposed to be or allowed to be provided or started for an adult or dislocated worker who doesn't gain unsubsidized employment. Follow-up services are not any type of performance tracking or any other method that isn't a direct benefit or service or engagement with an individual. So again, calling just to say, hey, will you send me a copy of your credential? Did you get your credential? Tracking IBIS to see if they were employed in their second quarter after exit or if they're self-employed. It's very, very important and essential to check in to gather that type of data, but it must not be documented as follow-up in any way. So that was clarified during the session to all of your staff and coworkers. Next slide, please. This question was put out there. And so just to clarify the point about the 1A, 1D follow-up and when it's allowed, in instances where an adult or dislocated worker does not obtain unsubsidized employment, is follow-up provided? You can answer in the chat. This is a much shorter presentation, by the way. So when we asked this question in the summit session, there are many slides in between. So there's a lot more information being given in that session. So this is probably pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. Mark and I wanted to include this. So this is the answer with the question. We don't want to completely redo the WIOA session, but we do want to make sure that everyone has this as a reference because it's very important we're all on the same page with this concept. And really, if you think about it, why follow-up services aren't allowed for a 1A, 1D who's not in unsubsidized employment is if you look at the key parts of the definition of follow-up services allowed for 1A, 1D. The theme there is they're all tied to employment in the workplace. It doesn't make sense to report you're doing follow-up for someone who you don't really know what they're doing, or if they're doing something not tied to employment, and that's just a WIOA regulation and law. So that is a reference slide. If some of your staff was there and mentioned this is exactly where they're coming from. So it will help you get on the same page. Next slide, please. Okay, the next 4 slides I will quickly go over, and these are called strategies for engagement, a deep dive into 1A, 1D follow-up for career planning. So what we provided here, and there were handouts given in the summit session. These were developed with LORDOM and policy and some partners. Part of follow-up is to figure out how to encourage dialogue to even get the conversations going. Counseling individuals about the workplace, assisting individuals and employers. So the key here is to not forget about part of follow-up can be you're getting a hold of employers. And then under all the bullet points are examples I won't get into. There can be referrals provided to other community services, but the key again is to get the dialogue going to figure out what they even need in their required follow-up. Next slide, please. And then all of the main bullet points are taken straight out of the definition of follow-up, the items A through F. Then when you're talking to the employer, there's an example. If you're at the individual level, more examples, what it means to connect individuals to peer support groups. Next slide, please. I do see some things popping up in the chat, and Mark, I can't even see the whole chat to know if you're answering, or we'll just open this up to questions. So it's up to what everyone wants, how we want to handle those. This is more strategies and a deep dive into youth follow-up engagement strategies, ideas on how to encourage dialogue. We need to figure out if they need it, and that can be done right off the bat in their ISS, and then how to give them the best resources or anything else that we can provide youth during follow-up. It's open up to more. I mean, we can provide supportive services as a youth element. So that opens up the window for a little more to be done for youth follow-up, depending on your local policy. So as just as long as all staff and everyone is aware and on the same page of what your local policies allow, and then how to get those benefits, how to dive into them and encourage them and engage them. That was the key to all this information. And next slide, please. Okay, these are more examples and questions on how to engage youth. And I want to point out to this group before I forget, we asked everyone attending that session, if they get back to work and think about it, we would really, really like examples of, I don't want to call it a best practices, but ideas or questions or strategies for engaging in follow-up and figuring out things to help them that work. Because I don't do this on a daily basis, obviously. So I have a feeling that out in the field, there are some little strategies or rules of thumb that might be being followed that everyone could benefit from. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is not going to be a poll, but we would also appreciate feedback from this group. So what we threw out there was this: supportive services cannot be provided in association with follow-up services for WIOA adult and dislocated workers. But as I mentioned, they are allowed for youth during follow-up. So the first question in the first place is, even though it's allowed, does your local area allow supportive services for youth during follow-up? Mark, I think we said we would just like them to please put their answers in the chat for this. Yes or no?
Yeah, I think actually I think we're near the end of the follow-up services part. So if you wouldn't mind, Kirsten, allowing, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll keep an eye on who's raising their hand and want to respond to any of these 4 questions. Either in the chat, you can do it that way, or or open up your microphone and we'll listen to you. We just really want to get a sense of these other questions, what your thoughts are, especially if reauthorization were to take up the option of some of these other questions that Paul is going to continue to go over. So if anyone wants to respond to any of these audio, go ahead and open up your microphone and we'll listen. Okay, Mike, good comment. And that's kind of where we're looking at this. Mike's response for WIOA 3, Mike Johnson, is the thought that they should be made available supportive services for the 1A, 1D participant if there are funds available. So that would come back to, again, what Paula said early on about a local policy. So you would have to look at that regularly and say, do we even have enough funds? What's our priority in utilizing our funds in serving them to allow for such supportive services? And then you'd have to be very clear in that policy which supportive services would you expect to be utilized during follow-up. Some of them, if you look at a list of typical follow-up services we see during active participation, wouldn't seem to even be necessary in a follow-up period of time. So you would certainly have to outline which of those services. We've had a lot of internal conversations about this once we started thinking about this question. And things like, okay, one of the follow-up services being counseling about the workplace. So that could happen over the phone, that could happen virtually, or that might need in-person contact. So you might need transportation for your participant in order to participate in that counseling. But would you need housing? Would you need other things? And so it again would be, if this were ever allowed, it would come down to you as a local board, your local boards, I'm sorry, determining first if they want to do it based on the available funds, and second, which services would be allowed, so that they're fairly and equitably shared amongst your participants, and not give anyone a sense that certain individuals are getting them when others are not.
Yeah, because I mean, adults, they can, we've had cases where adults are exited, they're no more than get exited, and then they're calling because on their new job they can't get back and forth to work now because the car is broken down and they haven't got enough money saved up to fix it. And as it is, it's like all we can do is try to make a referral somewhere because we can't assist directly.
And generally, keep in mind, Mike, that's a great point, because the whole purpose of follow-up services is to enhance or improve or maintain employment, right? So you've done all the due diligence of your career planning, getting that individual through all the career services training with supportive services potentially, and now they're employed. You want to keep them employed. And if that's something that could impair their ability to get to work, you certainly want to be there to support them, but also be mindful, as we say many times, WIOA is kind of a last resort of funds. So if there are support systems in the community, you should be looking at those first, and not just using WIOA. I think everyone would agree that there are limited funds. So I think if you can find another source of funds, you probably want to do that and keep those funds that you have for other uses. But that would be, again, part of that policy is dictating how you're going to determine, again, I mentioned equitable and make it accessible, is how do you decide that someone gets their car fixed versus here's a bus pass for quite a bit less until you can get the funds to fix your car, kind of thing. I think that becomes the difficult part of being a board is how do you make those decisions and ensure that your policies are fairly implied, or not implied, but imparted out to the customer base.
Yeah, and it seems like I mean, a logical length of time to have that available would be for the 12 months after exit or a year after exit, so it kind of aligns with the performance and everything.
Yeah, I think that 12-month period is really a key, and back to kind of your I want to get back to your other question in the chat, but I want to let others respond to this poll, and Paula also respond as necessary. If anyone else have thoughts? So LOE 11, LaDonna is indicating that they allow follow-up supportive services and follow-up for youth, which is certainly allowed. It'd be interesting if any of you want to put in the chat, if your local board has indicated we don't have funds to give support services in follow-up for youth. I don't know if anyone's not allowing them or if they're even allowed to not do that, but because I think that's one of the services that should be made available, even though it's also a program element. But as she's saying, they're very limited, so the policy dictates what the restrictions are, and I think that's key. That's great to hear, LaDonna. Is you really have to be very very detailed in how you're going to apply certain policies. And I think it's one, to make sure you have enough funds to serve your participants first, to get them the job. And then second, to help them maintain that job. I don't want to say it's secondary, but again, your funds only go so far. So anyone else with thoughts on if this were made available, whether you'd like it available for adults and dislocated workers? And maybe if your first thought is no, kind of some of the reasons why, other than maybe funding issues. Okay, hearing from no one else, we'll let you ponder that, and if we ever hear of reauthorization, discussing it, certainly in a either new act language or maybe some guidance to follow after that, we would want to make sure we're prepared as a state and locally to respond to any public comments that might be made available to that. Anything more you want to touch on this slide, Paula?
No. Thank you, though. Okay, so going back to the rules for when 1A and 1D follow-up is supposed to start, it's tied to entry in employment, never exit for 1A, 1D. This was our actuary's attempt. Actually, Mark Burge is our actuary, as Jim put it, to give a visual. And so this is a visual for understanding. You don't have to get into all of it, but this would be like a real world scenario, and it sums up all the possible decision points that an individual and a career coach could take going down the path of helping them and getting them a job. So completely separate from system limitations and case note or service. We just have to understand what triggers follow up, and then how to get it entered when it should be truly provided and reported for the law. Sorry, David, your text just popped up. So active participation from enrollment on. Then you have variations of phases of what they're doing. So at the point this person got a job on April 15th, 2024 with ABC Trucking, that triggers their follow-up period with their employment. But there's that window where you pretty much know that they've had their last service. You don't anticipate them needing anything else, but you can't hit the button on that system exit. So you have this 90-day window where you're providing follow-up activities. Please document them as a case note only. At the time where that window passes, and then you're following the rule where you provide it within the first 30 days for the first 3 months. You've finally gotten past the point where you know that they really had their last services. They're not needing WIOA anymore for participant level services. I shouldn't put it like that. And then you get to process the exit in the system to start tracking and reporting that current system. That's when you're allowed to put the follow-up service in with a date. continue documenting all of your follow-up services and case notes for the entire rest of the time, the entire rest of the follow-up period, which can be up to a year. And again, note, please, that started with employment date, never tied to exit unless it coincidentally landed on their start date of employment. So that can be utilized as a visual for the entire participation. It's also a good example of career planning activities. Next slide, please.
Yeah, before we move on.
Do you have anything to say? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I want to highlight just this orangish blue area here. So I'm zooming in a little bit. And Kirsten, we'll have her upload this to the documents pod, hopefully. And we'll get it out to all of the performance task force. We'll send it through Karen, so all of you have it, especially anyone can email us if you don't get this one way or another. But I wanted to zoom in on this because this is where Paula was talking about follow-up could start while you're still actively enrolled. And here's an example and a timeline where that might occur, where the individual becomes employed on 4/15, even though they're still going through maybe training services until 5/9 of the same year. So there's a period of time there of 20 some days where you're both in active participation and now have started follow-up services. So just be mindful that this is only one example. Probably most instances you're not going to have this overlap of career training, active participation services, and follow-up, but we just wanted to show one example of when that might occur. And then it gives, and I have to thank Laura Dom as well. She helped put some of this together, but she gave you the periods of time here, every 30 days or 90 days, where you should be doing some kind of contact. The career planner should be contacting the individual and ensuring that they're doing well in their new employment, and as time goes on still doing well, or if they need some assistance that would prompt the need for any particular follow-up services. So just wanted to show you what this looks like, because when we jump to the next slide, you won't see that because for youth it doesn't apply. You would never have an overlap. Okay, I'm on the youth now. And LaDonna, we'll respond to yours here in a minute once we're done with the last of these follow-up slides. Thank you.
Okay, so for the youth follow-up timeline, it's a little different because of the rules. Youth follow-up is required at time of exit. It doesn't have that tie to employment along with it. So we just wanted to reiterate and give a visual of the difference between what is true for 1A, 1D versus youth. You do have a follow-up period starting at day of exit. It's required every 30 days and can follow up. Oh, it can occur up to a year and actually more than a year if necessary. And probably it's on a case-by-case basis. Again, your local policy could better define this for your area and everything you can provide. Because like we said, even though WIOA allows supportive services for youth in follow-up, and maybe your policy does, it could be restricted with funds. So a lot of this might tie back to their ISSs and what was defined then, what you might know from day one they're probably going to need when they exit. So I'll leave it at that, not to take up too much time. And Mark said in chat, yes, this PowerPoint's available. And LaDonna, I saw your question, and that might be a group for our technical assistance work group or a specific task force. If you go back and look at the references for some questions, I don't know if that would help, because I would also dread feeling like a stalker just doing my job and sticking to WIOA rules for follow-up. So any insights on from you, Aloysius, who don't have that problem. I mean, maybe LaDonna, your individuals are so secure in their employment or whatever goal they met when they exited, it's just a foreign concept that they still need your help. And then in the first place, how do you, if they just want to give up on you, how do you figure out 6 months later that you could do something that would help them if they just dread even opening up the conversation? So that's my take on that. And I will leave that to everyone else to talk about in another session or time.
Yeah, and LaDonna, your point there at the end is really something that we probably should have touched on in this up front, is that we asked in the WIOA Summit session, when does follow-up start? And you're correct in your statement that it starts from day one. You should be setting the stage. While it's not considered career planning once they've exited or once they've started the follow-up period, it's really part of the plan. It really is. In that you should be setting the stage for what comes after they complete training and career services and get a job or continue on as a youth in further education. And hopefully that initial starting of the conversation helps them feel at ease that, hey, you know, while we feel like we're done, we know we've got a little bit more obligation to this program. And part of that conversation should be the obligation. Look, you're benefiting from this program, and the only way this program can survive is to show the legislators that it's working. And if we're not getting responses, then potentially that could be at the detriment of the program as a whole and could cost funding or whatever, especially when it potentially could lead to poor performance response because we can't get verification of wages, can't get verification of employment. And while those aren't follow-up services, they're still part of that period of time where you're trying to get information. But you know, as Paula said, it'd be great if we could have a couple LWIAs that would volunteer, thinking, you know, if they think they've got some really good practices in place, that they get good response. It might be first a good practice to ask all of you in a poll, not here, but maybe through the IWP task force, performance task force. What do you think your success rate of participants getting follow-up services are? So we can maybe identify a couple LWIAs that are doing really well in getting response and getting the participants to participate in follow-up services, and then see what they are doing. What is it like those slides that Paula put earlier on how you identify if someone needs a follow-up? Maybe we need some clearer questions or other questions that our career planners could have at their disposal that would help them get the outreach. We had somebody jokingly in one of our side work groups say they left a voicemail saying to the participant that their check was ready. How can we get a hold of them? And they heard back from them really rapidly. So, you know, I'm not advocating, I guess, lying to get follow up, but you know, or get response. But you know, maybe whatever you need to do, you do. So appreciate that little side note. But so I think we would like to ask at this time. Usually we wait to the end, but we're on the topic. If there's an LWIA that would like to share their best practices, how they're getting responses from participants in the follow-up period, let Paul and I know and we'll talk to you. You know, I think we had some really good responses last month when we had LWIAs 1 and 13, and again, I appreciate them providing some of their best practices around outreach and intake and applications process. That we'd like to find a couple more LWIAs that would want to do something similar to that and share your stories, share your successes in follow-up. So let Paul and I know if you'd like to be part of an upcoming webinar, or maybe if we only have one of you, we can incorporate it in the next quarterly office hours in August. So again, it's always something we are looking to hear from all of you. We don't know what you're doing out in the field necessarily, and we want to hear from you and have you share your stories with all the other LWIAs. And love the conversation going on in chat now. And David's absolutely correct. Some, youth probably are more difficult to get follow-up than adults and dislocated workers. But I think, there's still probably some things we can learn from others that would help. And so we'll try to put something together. Again, we'll accept anyone's offer to share their information, participate in a webinar, what have you, in the future. Christine is indicating we had a few customers who have had unsubsidized employment for a year prior to completion of services because of the need to complete a training program. And that will happen. That's why for the 1A and 1D, that's allowed to occur. And then she's not complaining, sorry, stating how IWDS right now is kind of an issue in tracking those. And that's correct. Our new system hopefully will not have this kind of challenge in tracking follow-up services when someone's still actively participating. We can't get the updates into IWDS right now, especially knowing that we're going to a second version of IWDS. So all you can do at this time is put in case notes, correct, Paula, to document that you're conducting follow-up services in accordance with policy, but you can't actually enter them as a follow-up service while they're still actively participating.
That is what we're trying to differentiate. And especially, I mean, with 1A1, with 1A, 1D, it's a foggier line. With youth, it's like it's required to exit. But with that caveat for 1A, 1D, many times they could be getting their goal dream job while you're still working with them. They're truly in an active service and receiving it. Just the system wasn't set up to capture that start date as a service. So it gets embedded as a case note. So in that case, but we just have to make sure that that case note is flagged as follow-up. Then it's when it truly started. When you start your follow-up at exit, just because, or you start tracking follow-up at exit, if they got employed a few months before, you're losing 3 months of providing that requirement. See what I mean? If you're just only ever acknowledging follow-up because of the exit date for 1A, 1D, maybe you were really doing it 4 months before. So that, I mean, sorry if I'm making that more confusing, but that's just what we were really trying to get across. And then the other key part, sorry to reiterate this, is we're like, well, wait, what do you mean to tell us? If someone, why can't we follow up if they're not in employment? And that is what DOL told us. It's not expected that we should be if they're not in a.
Yeah, I think to one of your slides earlier, Paula, to support that is, one, what is the definition of a follow-up? And really it is all about, now that someone in the 1A, 1D program, at least, it's all about someone that has now become employed in unsubsidized employment, ensuring that they maintain that employment and better themselves, maybe get better wages, move up the ladder within their organization, ensure that they're overcoming any challenges they might have. Some of our customers, your customers, haven't worked for a long period of time, maybe. And so it may take them a little while to get adjusted to do some simple tasks that we might consider simple that to others maybe aren't, because they're not used to it. They're not used to working around others necessarily. They're not used to taking direction from their boss because maybe they've been long-term unemployed or things of that nature. So, it's all about, and it might be a little bit of a challenge in itself, the definition, but follow-up services are all about the employment of that individual. And so I know there was a comment made earlier about the calls that help performance outcomes, and we would agree that those are necessary. They just don't fit into follow-up services. So maybe in a reauthorization attempt, maybe that's something that can change. That we could put some public comment out during a public comment period to say, we think follow-up services should be more broadly defined to allow for these things. But as they are now, unfortunately, those kind of things are just contacts that should occur. I know it takes time from your career planner's normal everyday activities, but it should be considered as part of the overall package from enrollment to follow-up period ending. That just has to occur. So and when we certainly want them to do that, so we can get the most positive outcomes as possible.
If I could follow up on a question that was asked in the chat, I think Dave asked when on this line follow-up should be open. So for the youth here, you say like in this example 416, but that may be the last active service, but then we have to wait 90 days before we can exit, and then we have to backdate the exit to 416, and then there needs to be follow-up services. But in between that 90 days, we're contacting the participants to try and get a hold of them to see if we need to revise the ISS or whatnot, and to see if we need to close out, like if we say we're going to exit them, or if we're going to provide additional services. So are you saying then we would also, like on the adult and dislocator side, we would document that 90-day period as in the case note saying it's follow-up? Because then when they get exited to 416, you would just have regular case notes, attempted contact, right?
Correct. So yes, if everything tells you that the ISS, their last service was secondary prep or post-secondary prep, something like the example, and the 90-day window passes, and that's factually, that did occur, that truly was their last active service. If you would have started documenting case notes as follow-up, because you're in your mind you're transitioning into exit, then you have a true date stamp on when their follow-up period began, right? Because it's going to go retro to the exit anyway, because that's when you kind of start it for youth. So for instance, that is completely fine to start it then. You won't be able to document that true service until their exit date, but that's okay, because then under that service date, you have all of the case notes to match, and they were truly done as follow-up at that time because of the perception of their service ending. They don't need anything else. If in instances where during that 90-day window, you can tell me how much this happens, the youth during a follow-up, because you think they're being exited, but something completely reverses, and whatever they're doing, they blow a major goal in the ISS. I don't know. And you're like, you know what? The 90-day window hasn't ended. They're truly still a participant. I'm expected to provide them a youth element they need. Starts the clock over. Those follow-up case notes truly just blend into career services or youth element, because that's truly what they were at the time, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Does it?
Yes. So
Okay.
then I think labeling of that case note, is it okay if it says follow up, even though you're providing services now after, let's say, 60 days, you're providing another service and you thought they were going to be exited, and so you put in the case note saying follow up, right?
Right. And from your perception as a career planner, if you know that that should, the prep to post-secondary should have been their last youth element, and you're providing youth follow-up. Maybe they look like elements, but if you know in your mind at that time, it truly is it's intended as follow-up, not a participant level youth element, because they are done, they're on their way, they met their goals, they don't need you anymore, correct. Then what those will roll into, like I said, are the career services. The thing that stops the clock is that youth element where you're like, okay, this is a hard stop. The follow-up transition phase is not going to be good enough for this person. They need fully back in the program within 90 days. Does that make sense? And Teresa Tice from DOL did say a good indicator to them in case notes, since there's no date that we put like, okay, we think that they're transitioning to exiting today, put that in case notes. At this point, all goals in ISS are complete, transitioning so-and-so to exit. Follow-up beginning, transitioning to follow-up.
Yeah, I think that's
Per
really
goals
key.
met. Does that make it more? I'm very sorry if I make it confusing, because the way it is set up right now, it is confusing. But we just want to make sure you get credit, and we define when the follow-up as defined begins. That's the confusion with youth though, Paul. Sorry to interrupt. The youth follow-up services look just like the elements. So.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I think,
Mark, what do you
her
think?
last point. Oh, go ahead. Who else was wanting to speak? Or was that
Anybody?
you, Paula?
I just said sorry to interrupt. I didn't
No.
want to make it more
No,
confusing.
and I was just going to follow up with that. I think you said what I was getting ready to say if you didn't there at the end is I think this becomes much clearer if you know the time when follow-up starts is when they've met their goals. For youth, it's a lot clearer because you should be done with all program elements. Your ISS is complete. You've reached your goal. Let's start follow-up services. For you, or I'm sorry, for adult dislocated worker, because you have that potential for overlap, you have to assume you're kind of done with all of those. But it's easier in the sense that you've got your unsubsidized employment, right? So you could say in the career plan, we want to get these career services, get through training, and get employed, and the employment happens before the training ends. Well, but you can't wait to start follow-up until that training ends, because employment is what starts it. So, we know there are going to be those instances where plans, as best as they were laid out, change in that 90-day period. Just document it, best you can. If you really have a question about it, that's when you can reach out to us. But if they're done with their plan, then they should be moving on to the next phase, which includes follow-up. And hopefully that helps make it a little bit clearer. I mentioned in the chat pod too, one thing we discussed at the summit that unfortunately, and apologize that we didn't put it on our slides here, is that unsubsidized employment for purposes of follow-up for adults and dislocated workers, is it tied to what their plan is? So we all know we need to pay for food. We need to live life while we're going through WIOA. And the fact that I'm working at McDonald's in order to make that happen, in order to allow me to participate in WIOA, does not mean I'm in unsubsidized employment, not for purposes of the WIOA, okay? So you're going to have those situations. The unfortunate part of that is, I don't know that we can differentiate that wage from employed, the WIOA employment wages for purposes of performance, but certainly from a perspective of, am I in unsubsidized employment to where I should start follow-up services? It's all about whether it's tied to that plan or not. And I I suppose maybe you could put in the plan that part of it was to get a part-time job to sustain things, to be able to get to school and back each day. But I don't think that's the end goal. And so that's how we're kind of explaining that out is this part of what the plan ultimate goal is? And that's the unsubsidized employment you're looking for. And so for the example from David Taylor, you know, a lot of registered nurses and other occupations start their job before completing their training. And if that's their job and it becomes unsubsidized, and then they're going to continue on with that training with the understanding that they have to complete the training in order to maintain their employment, then yes, that's when you would start follow-up. Because again, now that they have that employment, you want to help them keep it. You want to make sure they get to that next level of completing training. You want to make sure they get to that next level of a sustainable job and long-term career. All right, really appreciate a lot of the comments coming in. This is great, and reminding us of a couple points we covered maybe in the summit session that we hadn't put on here. So I'm looking to see. I think we've covered all the comments you've all made. Again, please think about if you've got some success getting some follow up with your participants and would like to share that, let Paul and I know. And we'll work with you to maybe set something up. I want to go ahead and move on. We'll go ahead and keep responding in chat if you've got some more questions on follow-up. But I'm going to go ahead and just quickly hit on the reauthorization points, and then we'll leave some more time if there's some questions at the end. So with reauthorization, it's they're giving it a different name, even though it's called reauthorization. WIOA had a defined length once it was signed into law that's just been extended since then. I think it was 2020. So we've had 3 or 4 extensions now. The U.S. House, and I'm just going to go over a quick introduction, then the timeline, and then get you some key performance implications of this potentially. But the House took this up in December. So in a short 5-6 month period of time, they progressed it through committees, voted on it strongly out of committee, and then voted on it strongly to pass through the House last month and referred it on to the United States Senate. The interesting thing there is that while they can take up the House bill proposal and vote on it with amendments, they've also got a committee, the Health Committee, as shown down there, that is also suggesting its own draft. So we don't know what's going to come of this. We don't know if it's going to be the House bill as written or with amendments, or if they're going to shift gears and pass through, attempt to pass through the Senate version of reauthorization. But I think it's clear that they'd like to get something done soon, probably in this under this administration, in case maybe it changes come November. So we might see some more quick movement on this in the next 3 or 4 months in order to try and pass it through, and maybe even quicker than that to try and get it out of Congress before the August recess. So it's going through quickly, which generally means there's some level of probability of it passing. I read one where that level was 33%, which isn't real comfortable to me, but to them that must be a very good number. So I don't know how many, I guess 2/3 of bills never make it through the committees. I guess 33% is pretty high in their minds. And I don't remember where I saw that stat, but anyway, it's moving along. So we wanted to just kind of give you a little information. Kind of the 4 key points overall is around performance is that they're changing a few of the current metrics and adding some more, especially one around retention. They're really focusing on employer-led training. So those OJT models, we'll talk about definitions here in a minute, customized training. I think, we've talked about this, especially if you've submitted a demand occupation training list petition. Paula and I and Shannon that review those and provide a final decision. Some of our responses talk about especially if we denied it because there's not enough data and information, is if there's employers out there with a need, but it's a small enough number that we can't really put this on the statewide list, work with them to get those OJTs, work with them to maybe get an apprenticeship set up, work with them to do some kind of employer work-based learning model that generally contractually indicates the individual upon successful completion is going to have a job. So I think that may be the impetus of their push towards employer-led training. Is the anticipation is that if you're involved as an employer, you're putting up some certain level of resources, that you're invested in this individual, they're invested in you, that it works out and they become a full-time employee upon completion, and everything's great for participant and employer performance perspective. So that's certainly a focus they're looking at. They're looking at a different process for negotiating. In fact, they take the negotiation kind of off the table in this version, and they give us if you've been hearing some of our other webinars and participated in Andy Blank from Northern Illinois University's SAM discussions, where they'll use a negotiation tool to kind of dictate what the levels of negotiated performance should be, and it's up to the states to provide the supporting information to say, sorry, we don't think that's accurate. Here's why. Let's come to some agreement. It just kind of shortens up the process a little bit, and maybe the tool itself becomes a little bit more stable in utilizing as the actual goal for each states. And then I'm not going to get into too much on eligible training provider list, because there's so many detailed pieces to that, but they're changing that, trying to make it a streamlined process, and including some other factors that go into applications for providers and programs, and again, really pushing employer-sponsored programs because of the high success rate for those. So let's jump into just a couple definitions. Some of them are changed. Employer-directed skill development would be the new customized training. They would remove out-of-school youth and consider them opportunity youth. The interesting thing there is when you change the definition, you kind of expect changes maybe in eligibility, but there's really no eligibility changes or very minor eligibility changes in this version of the Act reauthorization. So, you know, for all of you getting training from Jim Potts, it'd be great for him because he doesn't have to relearn all those eligibility. He doesn't have to reteach all of you eligibility if that's the way it goes through, or at least if it's minimally changed, that would be helpful in that regard. Pushes co-enrollment across programs. And then they talk about evidence-based. That's kind of an evaluation and analysis strategy where they really want to start having states, and I guess it would probably be rolled down to local areas at times, provide the reasoning of why they're doing things and why they're maybe implementing new policies or things of that nature. And then finally, work-based learning definition will be consistent with the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, so that we have a consistent set of definitions across all of our core partner programs. So not a whole lot of definition changes, but those were a few that would affect, again, performance and reporting, which is where Paul and I are housed here at OET. So some of the proposed metric changes is it would change the fourth quarter measure. Instead of it just being a number of individuals employed in the fourth quarter, it would now take a subset of those employed in second quarter to see if they're still employed in the fourth quarter. So it wouldn't be all of your participants in the second quarter and all of your participants that are eligible to be put in that denominator in the fourth quarter. It would just say, for a rough sample, if there's 1,000 participants in the denominator, 800 of them were successfully employed. When we go to look at the fourth quarter, we would only look at those 800 and determine if they're still employed. Now, the thing that it doesn't do, while it shows some kind of consistency in employment in two different quarters, it doesn't speak to whether it's consistently employed throughout that period of time. Could have been someone who's employed in second quarter lost their job, got employed fourth quarter, they would be a positive both times. It doesn't indicate it has to be with the same employer or the same job. So while it's trying to speak to retention a little bit, it really doesn't, in the sense that some of those key elements of retention that an employer would be more concerned about in keeping, you know, employees on the payroll aren't really captured in this. But it's you know, it's a step forward from what it is now. The second check mark here, Paul and I have looked at it 100 times and we have no clue what they're trying to say here. So that's what you get when you have not trying to mock them or knock them, but these legislators put language out that they maybe aren't familiar with what they're trying to write, and it doesn't come across clearly. And it would be one of those, if this went through the act, we would then have to wait for the final rules and TEGLs and TENS and other guidance to tell us what this means. We kind of think what it's doing is shortening up the period you can earn your credential from 1 year to 6 months, but that's not at all how that's written or how it would tie to an MSG. So I put it there just because it's interesting. And when we look at these, and when all of you look at these, those are the kind of things in a public comment period that need to be responded to. What in the heck are you trying to say here? We got to know what you're asking before we can agree that we think it's good. We just got a new employer satisfaction, or I'm sorry, effectiveness in serving employers, ESE, through a recent final rule that doesn't go into effect probably until the program year 28, that they're going to change it and be again more employer-based measure, and look at those individuals that are completing OJTs, RAPs, incumbent worker training, and other employer-directed, as it called it, skill development. So we might have a new sixth measure before we even get the newest one actually implemented. We haven't even negotiated on that measure, and probably won't do that until 2026, with it actually going into place again in 2028. And then it talks about asking percentage of individuals that are in paid and unpaid work experience. Again, I bring this up because it just points out how much they're looking at that as a success, that I think they think the people that are in work experience are getting a higher level of success from our programs than those that are not. So we should be looking at, even if this isn't passed, maybe there's statistics that show that. And we've talked about that, you know, that short period of time, if someone comes in the program in mid-May and go, how am I going to get an MSG before the end of the program year? That's one way you can do that, is through a work experience we've talked about before. So it's another strategy that, regardless of reauthorization or not, might be something your board might want to consider. Some other items that they talk about are the statistical models and methodology used. I was not aware, and this implies that departments of education and Department of Labor use different models. I'm not aware of that, but the only thing I can read from this is that maybe they do, and they're going to be more consistent in how they model all that statistical adjustment modeling data, maybe utilizing similar data points. I don't know, but again, wanted to point that out. And then I spoke about this earlier in the higher overview, the way that we'll actually look at our actual outcomes is that we got to do more evaluations and look at proposals for them. They do add in that the SAM will have to also account for some additional factors such as foster status, education level, high grade level completed. So that work group that Andy Blank and Brian Richard head up through NIU will have a lot more work to do to look at more revisions, do a statistical adjustment model if this were to go through. Another set of items here is there's some reporting requirements that are added. So local boards will have to publish their reports. I think a lot of yours do on your local websites, but this will be something that'll be required. While not a sanctionable measure, they're going to add what's called a median earnings gains measure that will be reported on by all local boards, meaning what was the earnings of an individual when they entered the program, and what are the earnings when they exit the program or become unsubsidized employment? And what is the difference there? So they're going to want to make sure, again, from a return on investment standpoint, did the program help them get a better job as far as wages? And some can kind of translate that into more long-term success and more long-term security. So again, it's not one listed as a sanctionable, one of the core measures. Wouldn't be negotiated. It's just something that would have to be reported on. All reports will have to be digitally. Now it's suggested, and the reauthorization will be required so that anyone can see it transparently on some website that is determined by the state and local areas. And then some other financial allocation data, and also some disaggregated information. So if we're reporting on credentials, if we're reporting on other things, what are the results of this in different populations, such as male versus female, or different races, things of that nature. And they've already started looking at that at the state level. They created a what used to be called not a disability, oh, help me out here, equity dashboard, and now they're just calling it a workforce dashboard. And they provide us some statistics from all the Pearl information we submit, where we can see our data and all the state's data. And so it's just something they're going to make more transparent and require shared, so people can see and really see if they maybe have some areas of concern that they aren't addressing in their current planning and processes. So we'll want to make sure we're looking at that data and seeing if we're consistent with what our population overall is, what our census data, what our normal, other data points are saying we should be serving, and the successes we should be getting. And in fact, going back to Northern Illinois, they've done a study out in Colorado that I think they're going to try to do in Illinois, showing some success rates of different disaggregated populations. And then I'll just go over this one really quickly. They're going to strengthen the success or unsuccessful requirements. Right now, states are held to 50% for each individual. That'll jump back to 80%, which we saw under WIA at one point, if I remember right. And so, we've got 70% at the local level. You see further down, it'll be 80% at the local level by the act. So we'll have to respond to that accordingly. To show success, it would be at 80%. The 90% haven't changed as far as overalls, whether that be overall indicator or overall program scores. That would stay the same. It beefs up a little bit of the results or sanction of not being successful in that, and we've already passed this on to you all to some degree, is that we would be required to not only get technical assistance after unsuccessful 1 year, but also implement a performance improvement plan, or PIP. And then after second consecutive year, this gets more stringent, is we lose up to 10% of our governor's funds, which is all of our statewide activities funds that we do all of our additional grant outreach to all of you that you apply for. So we would get hit. And then the worst one of all for all of you, I'll be honest in stating that second smaller check mark is there could potentially be a reduction in funds at the local level, which isn't in WIOA now, isn't something Illinois has implemented for certain. Surely I don't think we've ever talked about that. So, this would make it mandatory. So we want to make sure it's known to all of you and all your boards that if this continues on, that's one thing you all would be concerned about. If you are unsuccessful at a higher standard, it could cost funds if you miss out on one of those data points second consecutive year. And then clarifies that third consecutive year where potentially not only board reorganization, but it could affect ETPL providers if they're not succeeding at certain levels, or one-stop partners if it seems that maybe they're the reason for unsuccessful performance, and ultimately could lead to a redesignation of the local area itself, whether that be consolidation or just totally redoing the structure of it. All right, a lot of information. Again, you know, we don't know how fast this is going to go through. We don't know what'll make it in a final rule. As happened for WIA, if it goes to the president's desk and gets signed, there's many years of additional information that has to be shared, such as final rules that clarify. Those final rules always have a public comment period. Implementation of any performance takes time to get the data they want. So there would be those pilot periods where we would report on things but not be held accountable because they wouldn't know what level would be appropriate for negotiation purposes. But just wanted to share, there are some pretty significant things in here that you might want to share with your boards to start looking at, and if at an appropriate time outreach needs to occur. I think we always like to work with IWP, the state does, in a consistent message if something goes through. So we'll, I'm sure, be reaching out. I think that's why Lisa did the overall presentation last week, is just to let boards know that this is on the table and potentially moving through. And we'll, you know, we'll be online, Paul and I and whomever else in our area needs to be to help you through understanding what they're looking at from a performance standpoint. All right. Last thing, and then we'll open up for questions, is, you know, we have negotiations coming up, and I know I've reiterated this in a couple other of our webinars, but this is kind of what's going to happen over the next 3 months, 3 or 4 months, is that we're going to continue developing that negotiation tool. Andy presented it at the WIOA Summit, spoke after that summit with the working group that he's got assembled. I think it was a lot of very strong positive comments on what that tool is looking like. They will be presenting a webinar to release the tool probably in sometime in June, if not 1st of July. And that'll be tied to us doing some technical assistance as last outreach to all of you in preparing for the negotiations. But we're negotiating with DOL first week of June. We'll then let all of you know what our agreed negotiated goals are, so that you can take that into consideration as you continue your planning for the local board negotiation with us. Again, we'll get that tool out to you no later than hopefully early July at the latest, so that you can look at it and see it. It's a lot of data filled information and predictions on your PY 24-25 outcomes. We'll be providing, as I mentioned, technical assistance throughout this. And we'll be asking all of you to submit your expected or proposed levels sometime in August, which starts the scheduling of your negotiation. As it's happened the last 2 cycles, we'll do those the end last week or so of August and all through September. It's always first come, first serve. So the earlier you can get us your proposals, the sooner we can give you what's left available. And without wanting to rush anyone, it just might be something that's more of a concern for one LWIA than another of when you're available to meet with us. So you'll want to take that into consideration. And we've got one more, as I mentioned, August 21st, office hours, that will recap some of this as we get ready for those first negotiations. Maybe we'll have some questions that people are waiting for answers on that we can share with everybody at that time, along with any other updates and information that we have available at that time. So mark your calendars. It'll be the same as this one. I think it's the same link. Kirsten, can you confirm that if they've got it on their calendar today, that it's going to be the same link in 3 months?
Let me look.
Since we don't do registration, I think we're trying to keep a consistent link.
No, it won't be the same link as today.
Okay. Well, so we'll get out the link both in that weekly announcement of professional development announcement that the team at ICSPS sends out on Mondays. We'll also send it out through Karen Allen and the IWP Performance Task Force. So hopefully everyone that needs to can get that link, get it on their calendar. Mark your calendars now. 1 o'clock, I didn't put that on here, I apologize. Same time, 1 to 2:30. And we'll talk about negotiations, any updates in policy, and any further guidance that we feel we need to share with all of you around any topic. And then anything else that might come up to us in the next 3 months that all of you want to hear, let us know. We'll incorporate it. We've got about 5 minutes. Looking at comments here in the chat. I don't know. Just some nice comments of some of the history of our metrics. Pre me getting into performance, I remember some of these when I started in the policy unit, but not as familiar with some of those older metrics. But yeah, it looks like they're reverting in some aspects to some of the old ones, but most of them are staying the same, the individual indicators. So at least for consistency purposes, that'll be nice. But again, it's only a draft, and the Senate could say otherwise, and we could get no changes, minimal changes, or a total new list of changes. Who knows? We'll just keep an eye on it. If we see anything significant passing through us that we need to share with all of you, we'll be certain to do that. Any final questions or comments for us over these last couple minutes? All right, so yeah, I don't. So Paul is asking all of you who've been around a couple more years than me if they used to look at. I think that's that retention or that median earnings change metric now. Paul, is they will be looking at what the wages were at employment prior to enrollment, and then what they are at the end to see if there's hopefully a gain and show return on investment.
Yeah, for Mike's comment, if we're going, I think I remember that it was harder because they wouldn't let us count employment in the first and third quarter if we brought them in employed, right? Now they let us count if they come in with a job.
I think it was only the first quarter entered employment rate, where if a customer came in and their employment status on their application was employed, they were excluded from the entered employment rate, but they still affected the retention rate in the third quarter.
That's right. We could get credit later, but not right off the bat in that first quarter.
Right.
Yeah.
That median's earnings change, that sounds like what used to be called the average earnings change, which had to do with people's pre-quarter wages and post-quarter wages. And
yeah, the pre and yep.
Yeah.
Except for it changes from an average to a median, and whatever their reasoning to go to median versus average. I think they're, my understanding is it's because you didn't want to be negatively affected by someone going out and get a really high paying job or very low paying job, yet still be a good job, a good starting point, and it affect you otherwise. So I think that's why they switched to a median earnings, but we'll consider your thoughts on that, David, in a positive light. Any other questions or comments before we let you go for the day? All right, not hearing any. Please let us know if you've got any topics you want to hear the next time around in 3 months. If you want to share information on your follow-up services success that you'd like to be part of a presentation in the future, don't be shy. We know you all like to interact and speak, so we really need all of you to help us. We will also be issuing some changes to iPads the 1st of June, and we've got 1 or 2 people that are going to help us kind of go over some of those in a couple of different webinars. So start looking for information in both the professional development webinar, and also if you're a user of iPads, SIU WorkNet will send out some information of what's changing, and then also of when those webinars are going to be. They should be the first and second week of June. I think the first one is pretty set at June 5th. The second one, because of other conflicts, we're trying to determine the appropriate date and time, but it should be a week following that first session. So look for those, and hopefully you're able to join us in those and learn how IPAS can be benefit to all of your career planners and all of you in case management and performance. Thank you all for participating. We really appreciate it. I love the interaction today and all the questions and comments.
Thanks, Mark and Paula.
You're welcome.